6. That is exactly the number of inches an arrow penetrated right into the skull of a 16-year-old Prince Henry at the bloody Battle of Shrewsbury back in 1403. It pierced his face just below his right eye. Now, for most people, well, that's where the story ends, right? But remarkably, this young prince didn't even fall. He literally just kept fighting. But, surviving the actual battle was one thing. Surviving medieval medicine was a totally different beast. To save the prince's life, an English surgeon named John Bradmore stepped in with just a wild pre-antibiotic medical procedure. He literally invented and built a custom tool on the spot to reach deep into the skull and extract the arrowhead. Then he packed the wound with wine and probes to help it heal and keep the infection at bay. And against all odds, no way, it actually worked. The prince survived to become one of history's absolute most famous monarchs. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, our explainer is cutting right through the Shakespearean myth of King Henry V. You probably know the legend, right? The rousing speeches, the glorious underdog victories, but our goal here is to look way past that highly romanticized legend and see the gritty historical reality of this famous warrior king. Let's find out who the man beneath the crown really was. Section 1. Forged in Battle. The Welsh Campaigns. So, to really understand Henry V, we have to start with the massive burden he inherited. His dad, Henry IV, had usurped the throne from Richard II in 1399, which left the Lancastrian family's grip on power, well, deeply insecure. Because of this, young Henry was handed immense responsibility super early on. He was sent to command royal forces in Wales at just 19 years old. There, he faced a grueling, nearly decade-long slog to suppress Owain Glyndwr's rebellion. But you know what? It was here that Henry truly came of age. He completely ditched his dad's ineffective hit-and-run tactics. Instead, he learned the vital importance of systematic sieges, retaking key fortresses like Aberystwyth and Harlech, and actually holding them. And just as crucially, he learned about fiscal management. Henry constantly had to beg his father for money to supply his troops. He realized early on that military skill is totally useless if you don't have the hard cash to back it up.
Moving to Section 2, The Burden of the Crown, a Messianic Mission.
Let's move on and see how this built, because everything shifted in 1413, when Henry ascended the throne at just 26 years old. This moment profoundly changed him. The story actually goes that on the night his father died, Henry visited a local hermit, stayed up all night discussing morality, and completely cast aside his youthful exuberance. Plus, his coronation took place during a freak spring blizzard which people at the time viewed as a sign of a cleansed, totally new era. He took on this heavy, messianic sense of divine purpose, and that immediately bled into his foreign policy. He wasn't content just being King of England. No, he looked back at his great-grandfather, Edward III, who had started the 100 Years' War to claim the French throne. Knowing that the current French king, Charles VI, was suffering from severe mental illness and the French nobles were locked in their own civil war, Henry saw his opening. He formed an immediate, truly audacious ambition to restart the war and seize the crown of France as his divine birthright. But of course, that brings us to a very practical question. How exactly do you fund a holy war? Well, Henry went on an aggressive fundraising campaign that would honestly make a modern politician blush. He hit up supporters for loans, he milked trade subsidies, and he demanded donations from all across the country. And in a move that really reveals his absolute desperation and total commitment, he even used the kingdom's treasures as collateral. He literally pawned the royal crown and the crown jewels to fund his army. He plunged the kingdom into massive debt before he even set sail.
Section 3. The Agincourt Campaign. Marching into Mud.
So, in August of 1415, Henry landed in France and laid siege to the town of Harfleur. He was expecting a quick victory, but it turned into a months-long nightmare. We're talking relentless bombardment, starvation, and worst of all, a massive outbreak of dysentery among the English forces. But when the town finally fell, Henry did something highly strategic. Now, what's really interesting about this is how he established a strict code of conduct for his soldiers. He ordered that no churches be pillaged, no clergy or women be harmed, and absolutely no unauthorized foraging take place. You might be wondering why. Well, because Henry wasn't trying to act like a foreign conqueror. He was trying to act like the rightful king of France. He wanted to build trust with the local populace and really show them he was a moral, just ruler. But despite all this moral posturing, his actual position was incredibly dire. Seriously, if you ever feel like the odds are stacked entirely against you, just consider Henry's men. His original force of 12,000 had been depleted to about 9,000 starving, exhausted soldiers, with so many of them sick with dysentery, as they began a super dangerous march toward the port of Calais. Meanwhile, the French had amassed a massive, well-rested, and fully supplied force of over 12,000 men. To make matters worse, the French intentionally destroyed bridges and fords to herd Henry's weakened army exactly where they wanted them, right toward a small town called Agincourt.
Section 4. Victory and Brutality. The Climax of Agincourt.
Picture this. It's the morning of October 25th, 1415, and Henry's men are completely cornered. Forced into a narrow battlefield bordered by thick woods, and knowing they were about to face a massive French cavalry charge, Henry ordered his archers to drive sharpened wooden stakes into the ground defensively. But honestly, the real MVP of Agincourt? The mud. Heavy rain had fallen the entire night before, turning the freshly plowed field into a devastating trap. When the battle kicked off and that massive French cavalry charge, they found themselves funneled into this tight space, slipping and sliding in incredibly sticky mud. They were completely neutralized. And on top of that, Henry's longbowmen unleashed a terrifying, sky-darkening hailstorm of arrows. The French forces got so tightly packed together in that mud that they literally couldn't even swing their swords. But in the absolute chaos of the battle, Henry made a decision that still deeply stains his legacy today. So the crucial point here is comparing these two realities. On one hand, we see the noble rules of war he established earlier to protect the innocent, but on the other hand, we have the Agincourt Order. Mid-battle, Henry realized he just didn't have enough men to guard the massive number of French prisoners they had captured. Terrified that these prisoners would grab discarded weapons and attack his men from behind, he gave the ruthless order to massacre thousands of unarmed French captives. It was an incredibly brutal, ignoble violation of medieval rules of war. When the dust finally settled, the French had suffered an absolute, unmitigated disaster. An estimated 7,000 French troops and auxiliaries were dead or injured. Against all mathematical and physical odds, by brilliantly utilizing the terrain and the devastating power of the longbow, Henry had secured a spectacular, if, as we just saw, incredibly brutal victory. Section 5. The Regent of France. A dream realized? Now, Henry was smart enough to know that one battle doesn't win a war, so, returning to France, he began slowly, methodically, choking out resistance town by town. Between 1417 and 1420, this campaign showcased his absolute, ruthless pragmatism. A prime example is the long siege of the Norman capital of Rouen. The desperate townspeople inside expelled their starving poor, women, children, and old men, just hoping the English would let them pass through their lines. But Henry? He coldly refused to show mercy or feed them, forcing them to languish and starve in the freezing trenches between the city walls and his army. When he was questioned about this brutal tactic, he simply stated, "I did not put them there." Wow. That brutal efficiency ultimately forced the French to the negotiating table. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute diplomatic zenith of Henry's entire reign, the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. The French completely caved. Henry was officially named Regent of France, he was given the French Princess Catherine in marriage, and it was firmly agreed that upon the death of the current French king, Charles VI, the crown of France would pass directly to Henry and his heirs forever. It seemed like he had done the impossible. He had united the two kingdoms. But, as we often see in history, and honestly in life, the brightest peaks are very often followed by the steepest cliffs. Which brings us to Section 6, a fragile legacy, the fall. That incredible glory, it was very short-lived. After his brother Thomas was killed in a pretty foolish skirmish at Villers-Bâgé, that invincible English aura was completely shattered. An exhausted Henry was forced right back to the front lines to try and stabilize the region. He dove back into grueling sieges, most notably at Meaux, in just absolutely miserable weather. And wouldn't you know it, once again, dysentery struck the English camp. But this time it claimed the king himself. Henry V died in August 1422. He was just 35 years old. And in a twist of truly bitter historical irony, he died only a few short weeks before the mad French king Charles VI. If Henry had lived just a little bit longer, he would have officially been crowned King of France. Instead, everything Henry had built unraveled with astonishing speed. The throne passed to his son, Henry VI, who was literally just an infant at the time. A regency government simply could not sustain Henry V's aggressive military momentum. And as Henry VI grew up, he proved to be mentally unstable, which led to a complete collapse of English power. By 1453, England was entirely expelled from France, which finally ended the Hundred Years' War, and plunged England itself into the bloody civil wars that we know today as the Wars of the Roses.
So, this leaves us with a really fascinating question to end our explainer on. Is Henry V's legendary status actually deserved? Was he truly England's greatest warrior king? Or, when you look closely, was he just a copycat of his great-grandfather Edward III, using the exact same playbook? A king whose premature death conveniently saved him from having to deal with the unsustainable financial ruin and the inevitable collapse of his own holy war. It is a massive what-if of history, and definitely something to consider the very next time you hear a rousing tale of a flawless historical hero.